Back when cartoon license games had their time in the sun, many of the titles that were released on home consoles also had a handheld equivalent made alongside it, for better or for worse. Sometimes these games could end up being great on their own, but more often than not, they just ended up being the weaker version of the two. Unfortunately, due to the limited hardware capabilities of handhelds like the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS in comparison to the GameCube and Wii respectively, the handheld variants of these games could usually end up being inferior and unrelated to the console versions, but not always. Funnily enough, the subject of today's video tends to blur that line a little bit, considering that, while it's not an amazing game, it does surpass the console version in achieving what it sets out to do. Now, I'm personally partial to 3D games over 2D ones, but I can't deny that SpongeBob SquarePants Revenge of the Flying Dutchman for the Game Boy Advance is the superior version. If you've seen my other video on the console version already, you'll understand that the development hell that game went through was the result of numerous variables, but luckily the GBA version didn't suffer the same fate. With the release of the Nintendo Switch in 2017 came the gradual dissolve of the handheld gaming market. The 3DS was soon put to rest, and the PS Vita bombed horribly sales-wise, so that was never going anywhere, leading to the unfortunate decline of handheld games. In the classic sense. Mobile gaming has fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, managed to fill that gap, but that market has its own slew of issues that I'm not here to get into. I figure that since I've already covered the console version of Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, it'd be nice to check out the handheld version and see how that stacks up in comparison. And I tell you, I was pleasantly surprised. My only experience with the handheld SpongeBob games derives from playing my sister's copy of Battle for Bikini Bottom on the Game Boy Advance back when we were younger, which I believe she sold at the same time I sold my portion of games to GameStop. Those who've seen my Disaster Strikes video will recall that story. And I also own a copy of The Yellow Avenger on the Nintendo DS, but if memory serves, I didn't enjoy it all that much. I don't have particularly fond memories of either of those games, but I suppose I'd be willing to return to them at some point for future videos. That will be for another day, however, seeing as Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is up to bat at the moment. Believe it or not, this game was actually developed by Vicarious Visions of all developers, the same company responsible for the Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 remake and the Crash N. Sane trilogy, of all things. Yeah, these guys have certainly come a long way from the days of old when they were primarily known for making handheld license games for the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. Revenge of the Flying Dutchman GBA actually ended up selling an estimated 740,000 copies according to one source, and landed itself in the century's top 50 handheld games of all time, which was published back in 2006. And despite how much I disagree with this placement, they ranked it above games like Minish Cap, Spyro Season of Flame, Wario Land 4. I mean, that right there may as well be an act of war. Wario Land 4 is the greatest GBA game of all time. Don't at me. So, needless to say, this game did manage to get some relative amount of success and recognition during its heyday. But I suppose we should go ahead and dive right in to see what our favorite porous undersea sponge has gotten himself into this time around. Ah man, gotta love those Game Boy Advance MIDI quality sound files, am I right? Just booting the game up, it seems like things were off to a good start. I mean, you get the classic TV show intro in pixelated Game Boy form as SpongeBob puts his pants on and gets ready for the day. You get to the title screen, press start. Seems pretty faithful, right?
Haha, wrong.
This game uses a password feature. Alright, so yes, I know I'm not the first person to say this, but password features suck. Hope you had a pen and paper ready back in the day, because if you didn't pause your game and write down the passcode before turning it off, you just lost all of your progress and have to start all over again. Or you can just look up the password online that unlocks all the levels for you, but where's the fun in that? At this point in time in the gaming industry, there really wasn't any reason why the game couldn't have a functioning save feature. Console games and handhelds have both been pulling that off for over a decade at that point. Sure, it wasn't quite as standard as it would become just a few years later or anything, but even the original Game Boy supported games with a save feature. I genuinely wonder if there were advantages to using a password system over a save feature during the 5th and 6th console generations. If anyone knows a reason for this, then by all means, fill me in because I'd love to know. But whatever, this truly wasn't as big of a deal for me because I ended up beating the entire game in a 3-hour sitting. It's not really a long game even for somebody who's never played it before, so as you can expect, there's probably not much to the plot of this game, is there? Well, no. In fact, the plot of this game has just about the same level of depth that the console version did, with a few variations and tweaks here and there. For instance, the game starts up and Gary goes rushing to find a treasure chest containing a bottle containing the Flying Dutchman. But instead of kidnapping Gary and the other residents of Bikini Bottom one by one like in the console game, he promises SpongeBob one wish in exchange for him rushing around all of Bikini Bottom and finding the Dutchman's 10 lost treasures. Not 7 this time around, 10. And that's about it. From there, the game branches off into 3 different pathways that you can play in any order you wish. There's the option to go to Jellyfish Fields and go jellyfishing with Patrick, or you could go to Goo Lagoon and spend some time with Sandy. You've also got the option to go help Mr. Krabs make deliveries at the Krusty Krab if you so choose. Each of these hubs are then broken up into 3 levels and a bonus game. In the case of Patrick, there's Jellyfish Fields, Kelp Forest, and a maze of hooks inspired by the episode Hooky. Sandy offers you Muscle Beach, some weird cave underneath the boardwalk of Goo Lagoon, and a carnival on the pier that was seen in the Valentine's Day episode. And then, of course, Mr. Krabs has you go to Rock Bottom, deliver a pizza after trekking through the outback, and traversing a snow level, which I'll get back to later. Yes, they literally designed an entire level out of the pizza delivery episode. Almost every single one of these levels contains some sort of reference to the show, whether it's to a particular episode or just a general setting in Bikini Bottom. I can't quite figure out what the boardwalk level is a reference to though. Every other location I've managed to figure out, but I'm not sure if I'm just forgetting about a particular instance in the first few seasons or if it's the only level in the game that doesn't have a connection to the show whatsoever. Anyways, each of these levels features 3 distinct keys with a red, blue, and green gem, all of which are needed to open the Dutchman's treasure chests in each location. The treasures are much more diverse and less gross than the console versions though. In that game, if you recall, you'd see things like a sock or dentures, but here you get items like a Medal of Dishonor, a bowling trophy, and the Dutchman's family photo album. Most of the keys are pretty easy to find as you'll tend to just stumble upon them along the way. However, there are a few levels where they're actually remarkably easy to miss if you don't explore every nook and cranny as you come across them. Like this one in the Kelp Forest, for example. After the very first door you walk through in that stage, you can see a single gold doubloon floating in mid-air, serving as the sole signal that if you use the float bubble power-up, there's actually a secret area up top that you need to access in order to get the red key. While I agree that the doubloon should signal in to the player that there is something up above, I know that not everybody has that same level of instinct while playing a game. Let's say you collect the doubloon without thinking and then continued through the rest of the level. From that point on, you'll have no way of recognizing that this area is up here, and you'll either have to discover it by complete accident or give up and look up a guide. I'm not saying this is a flaw in the game design, no, but I don't think a required item should have been hidden up there. This sort of secret would have been more fitting for some extra lives or a bonus game of some sort. Usually when games do something like this, hiding an obscure room somewhere, it's meant for an optional objective or a power-up rather than something that will roadblock you from beating the level outright. The same principle, I feel, should have been applied in this game. But at the very least, you do get to see that Squidward formed his own special club away from SpongeBob and Patrick, along with starting a new tradition where he plays the clarinet so badly that the walls around him spontaneously break themselves out of existence. The absolute worst level in the game, though, is undoubtedly Snow Business, the final level of the Krusty Krab branch. Snow Business isn't particularly hard or anything, it's just so unbearably long and uninteresting. It's essentially the desert level of the game in the sense that it drags on for way too long and isn't incredibly exciting to look at, only it's made of snow instead of sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. I will say, though, that this isn't a very common occurrence in this game's level design. In fact, it was the only level I ended up getting lost in at all. Despite many of them feeling somewhat open and non-linear, it was never really a problem finding all 3 of the keys in each world. I will say that I did not go for 100% during this playthrough, seeing as the completion incentive wasn't really worth it to me, so I don't have the perspective of somebody who did collect all of the doubloons. Every other level in this game took me no more than 10 minutes at most to complete. Snow Business took me 23 and a half, more than double the stage time for any other level. Between the winding mazes and losing track of where you've already been and the monotonous tedium of having to attempt the same jump over and over and over again for every time you miss, it quickly begins to detract from what was a relatively fine experience otherwise. And go figure, it was the last level I played before the final stage too, which has its own fundamental problem. That being that if you end up losing all of your lives, you have to start the entire stage all over again from the very beginning. Listen, I can be more forgiving on the final stage if it's longer than all of the other levels in the game. I mean, it is the final challenge. I'd say that's a reasonable balance to meet. But my god, could you imagine getting to the final boss of the entire game and losing your last life, only have to do the entire 20-minute platforming stage all over again? Because that's exactly what happened to me when I played this. I took too many hits from the Flying Dutchman. Oh, yeah, spoiler alert, he's the final boss, in case that wasn't obvious. Died and had to start the entire stage all over again. And while I'm on the subject of bosses, I'd like to add that it can sometimes be a challenge just to figure out how to actually hurt these guys in the first place. Take the Alaskan bullworm, for instance. This guy comes at you from one of 4 corners of the screen and spits a projectile out. At first, I was just jumping around trying to dodge them, waiting for an opening to hit him. Usually, bosses have periods of invincibility before giving you an opening, you know? I couldn't just run up and hit the guy, so I knew there had to be some sort of catch here. So then, a few minutes go by as I continue jumping around non-stop, only to realize that he never actually stops spitting these things out at you, and you're actually required to use the karate gear to hit the projectile back at him. Unfortunately, the game never gives you any indication whatsoever that you're able to reflect these projectiles back at him using the karate gear, and while I did figure it out eventually, it would have been nice if it were just a little more clear that that's what you were supposed to do there. Perhaps having a gimmick in the previous level where you need to hit projectiles back at something to teach you that concept before just plopping you into a boss fight and expecting you to know how to do it would have been a smarter choice here. Also, the same gimmick gets brought back for the final boss with the Flying Dutchman, except in his case you have to reflect these barrels back at him instead. Lo and behold, just like with the Alaskan bullworm, I had no idea you had to hit these barrels into him, and before anybody else says I should have learned from the battle with the bullworm, unlike that fight where bubbles did absolutely nothing to affect the boss, here the Dutchman flickers every time you hit him with one. I'd also like to point out that in all of the other previous boss fights, the bosses emit a stun animation after they get hit where they kind of flicker in place, and 2 of the 3 boss fights take damage from, you guessed it, SpongeBob's bubbles. So I was under the assumption that I was doing damage to this boss by avoiding the fire and barrels and hitting him with bubbles when there was an opening. And then, after several minutes of not getting anywhere, I began to question why he wouldn't just die already. Well, it turns out that he was never taking any damage in the first place because I was supposed to knock these barrels back at him. Considering that they just randomly drop down from the top of the screen and then roll along the ground, is it wrong for me to be critical of the game for this? I mean, nothing about their behavior indicates they can be hit back at the boss. They look like an obstacle you're supposed to avoid, at least in the case of the Alaskan bullworm. When he spit projectiles at you, they were coming at you and it made sense to hit them away. Even then, the trajectory on these barrels is very difficult to aim, so even if you do figure that out, it's still a guessing game on whether or not you're actually going to hit the barrel into him or send it flying off in a completely different direction. The boss fights aren't the greatest, but at least I can say that the level design mostly makes up for it. I had a lot of fun platforming around the different stages in this game. SpongeBob's primary form of movement is a hover ability similar to what was seen in the 3D game, as well as a bubble attack which can do various different things depending on the type of bubble soap that is currently equipped. You've got the normal bubbles, which encase jellyfish in bubbles that allow you to stand on top of them for a short period of time in order to platform. Bounce, which sends you flying upwards after you jump on top of it. Strong, which is used to damage enemies outright and break down barriers blocking your path. And Float, which allows you to stand on top of the bubble while floating upwards to reach higher places. Kinda makes the bounce power-up a little redundant, don't you think? The float and bounce power-ups also take away your ability to attack jellyfish, so you're pretty much defenseless while those 2 soaps are equipped. Oh, and you can only have one soap enabled at a time, so if you have the float ability equipped but need strong, then you're gonna have to go find it placed randomly around the level in order to swap soaps and then go back to the area where you needed it. Not the most ideal scenario for this sort of thing. It would have been better if you only had to pick up the items once in the level and then you got to cycle through them for the rest of it, but it is what it is. SpongeBob also gets 3 additional tools added to his abilities as the game goes on. After beating the second level of each world, you unlock a bonus game that nets you an item given by whoever's path you're currently on. Patrick hands you a jellyfish net, which you can use to catch jellyfish, making you less vulnerable whenever you're forced to have the floater bounce bubbles equipped. Sandy gives you karate gear as a means of attack that acts similar to the strong ability, and Mr. Krabs gives you squeaky boots that allow you to run faster and jump higher. Man, I'm not gonna let you poison me. Unfortunately, I took Mr. Krabs' path last, so I didn't end up getting these until the very end of the game. I can imagine it would be much more enjoyable if you chose his path first and played the other 2 routes after acquiring the squeaky boots, because having the increased movement capabilities makes the platforming a breeze. The bonus games aren't too difficult either, although Sandy's is easily the hardest since you can't really afford to miss chopping any of the acorns, otherwise you're pretty much guaranteed to fail the mission. The other 2 weren't that bad though, in my experience. You can also come across some bonus games along the way, such as the Jellyfish Rodeo with its pseudo 3D effect as you ride the jellyfish towards the screen and try to snag doubloons along the way. This was my main source of lives that prevented me from game overing, seeing as you could usually get 3 or 4 of them every time you played it. There's also the Simon Says game, which also happens to be a reference to Jellyfish Jam. You gain access to this after the first level and is basically an easy way to rack up lives before playing the rest of the game. After collecting all 10 treasures, you head to the Dutchman's ship and hand them over, at which point he then decides to betray you and kidnap all of SpongeBob's friends at once, instead of slowly accruing them over time, only for SpongeBob to go through the final level, climb aboard his ship, and save all of them 5 minutes later. But hey, at least it sorta ties into what happens in the console game again, and you also get to choose what wish you want SpongeBob to ask for at the end of the game. Your completion stats determine how many possible endings you have access to, but since I didn't really bother to go for all the doubloons after the first level, I only had 3 available to me. All they amount to are pixelated JPEGs of the characters doing something, so really it's not all that exciting, and I'm putting them all on screen for you now. But hey, one of them is a direct reference to the previous SpongeBob game that Vicarious Visions had worked on, so that's a nifty little Easter egg, all things considered. But yeah, if Disaster Strikes was anything to go by, I should definitely lower my expectations when it comes to completion rewards for handheld games, because I cannot imagine going for 100% on this would feel worth it to me. All in all though, Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is a game that I can definitely recommend. In fact, I'd even say it does a better job of achieving what it sets out to do than the GameCube and PS2 versions. As a 2D side-scrolling platformer on the Game Boy Advance, it's a perfectly serviceable product. If you're looking for a game you can beat easily in one sitting, then this might be the one for you. Seeing as Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is only one of numerous SpongeBob games created over the years, this is only the beginning for me on this channel. Also, be sure to check out my review of Battle for Bikini Bottom, which I made quite some time ago in case you're looking for more SpongeBob content from me. I'll definitely be returning to the Yellow Undersea Sponge again in the future, so feel free to leave some recommendations in the comments below for other games of his that I should check out. Until next time, Shadowstreak, signing off.